there, I hope you managed to keep as cool as possible in this ridiculous heatwave that we're having in the UK at the moment. This Silverbird selection video is a little bit different to the normal ones. You might have noticed my recent video that I put up on the channel, my gaming memories video of 10 of the best original BBC Micro games. So I'm going to stick with the BBC Micro and look at the 4 games that were released for the BBC Micro in the Silver Range and Silverbird packaging by Firebird software. There were 3 games that were released in the Silver Range packaging, and they were actually reissues of games that had already been released by Firebird in their earlier white and red packaging. There's also just 1 game that they released in the Silverbird packaging, so we're going to be taking a look at all 4 of those in this video. Before that though, you might have noticed, if you're eagle-eyed, that there's a new TV behind me, and that's part of my new tech setup that I'm using to record my videos in the future. So I'm going to take you through a little look at that first, so you can see what I'm going to be using from now on to record all my videos. I'm still going to be recording on original hardware, and that means lots of tech connected together to be able to turn it into HD video. So let's take a look at that, and then we'll take a look at those 4 games. So before I start this, the reason I'm moving to using some newer tech is basically because my older tech's starting to have problems. My TV that I've been using for over 10 years has started to not switch on, and it takes me like 10 or 15 attempts to actually power it on. So I figured that's on the way out. And this camera that I'm using, I've dropped that on the floor a couple of times, and it's also been having problems with recording at times, and you've seen probably on some of the videos the focus. So I'm actually going to be replacing all that setup and trying to be a bit more sort of 21st century, if you like, rather than just pointing a camera at a screen. So I've got a new TV. It's not really a new TV, it was in our bedroom, but I've recently updated that TV to a bigger one. So this is like a 20-inch HD LCD screen. It's only 720p, but it'll do the job. That's got an HDMI input and a SCART input, so it'll do the job for the sort of things I want to use it for. So to connect to that, to the computer, the BBC in this case, I'm using this, which is a SCART to HDMI converter. That's actually not connected to the TV. It's actually connected to this, which is a USB video capture thing. So this I got off Amazon. It was about 10 quid. This thing was about 15 quid off Amazon. I did originally buy this one, but that is composite AV only. And the BBC Micro actually uses RGB, so I had to get a more expensive one. So this was composite or RGB, so I can use it with RGB consoles, but I can also use composite from things like the Commodore 64. So that's piped through from there into this capture card, and that's then got a pass through into the monitor of the TV, and also it's giving a USB connection to this laptop. This is a reused laptop. This is my wife's old work laptop. It's unfortunately Windows 8 machine, but it does the job. So I've got OBS installed on that, which is a open source or freeware streaming and recording thing that I downloaded that seems to work with the capture hardware. So as you can see, I've got the BBC Micro on that screen and also on this screen, so I'll be able to play stuff and record it at the same time. That's that bad focus I was talking about on the camera. So yeah, there's also a microphone. Now usually I'll be using this microphone to talk when I'm talking on my videos for Commodore 64, but because the BBC Micro's got its own built-in speaker, I've actually got this microphone at the moment connected to the, just sitting above where the speaker output is on the beeve. This bubble wrap is just to try and stop any external noise from getting in, but there you go, there's that microphone. So I'll be using that to speak when I'm talking on my videos. So the format of the videos won't change. I'll still be playing the games as I talk about them, but I'll be capturing it all on this thing instead. Unfortunately, the hardware is not that great in this laptop, so I won't be able to record it at full HD, but I've found a resolution that seems to work for the recording aspect. It's good enough. I think it'll give a better and more consistent picture than what I've been getting by pointing the camera at an old TV screen. So hopefully you'll see it as an upgrade in the hardware. I have to say it takes a lot more work to get all this working than it does just pointing a camera at a screen, but I think the benefits will be worth it in the end once I get used to the tech and stuff like that. So there you go, that's my new setup. I obviously won't leave it all hanging around like this once I've got it all up and running properly. This is my first test of it for this video, so I'm going to boot up my SD card on the BBC Micro. There you go, it's up on the screen, and let's get started at looking at those 4 games. Let's get started then, and we'll go through these games in alphabetical order.
Now for these 4 games I've got no physical media, therefore I haven't got any inlays to look at, but what I have managed to do is find all the inlays from a site called Acorn Electron World. I'll put a link to that site in the description. They've got a very detailed list of information about Firebird software and all the games that were released for the BBC Micro and Acorn Electron. So first up we've got Bird Strike. This was re-released in the Silver Range packaging in 1987, originally released in the earlier Firebird packaging in 1984. And as you can see, it's very similar looking to the Commodore 64 Silver Range packaging. They've chosen a sort of pale blue border instead of the red one for Commodore 64 for the BBC and Electron. The back of the inlay though is a little bit different. It's only got 1 screenshot instead of the normal 2, and there's no foreign language descriptions of the games, and I imagine that's simply because the BBC Micro wasn't exported very far. There wasn't much of an uptake for that system in the European territories, so it probably didn't make a lot of sense to put the information on the back in the other languages like it is on the Commodore 64 Amstrad and Spectrum versions. So pretty nice cover. Logo's a bit strange, but there's a nice image of the bird flying away from this plane. And the back cover says, wing a plane to release a carrier pigeon. Shoot the carrier pigeon to add a note to the stave at the top of the screen. Shoot enough pigeons to complete the tune without getting wiped out by the relentless pursuing planes. Next wave. So basically it's just giving you all the instructions for the game on the back rather than inside. I'm sure they were inside as well. So pretty nice cover. Let's move on to the game itself. And it starts off with a pretty nice title screen, Bird Strike written quite nicely. You can see it's copyright Andrew Freegard, if that's how you say his name. And it says, somewhere in Europe 1914, planes are destroyed by a direct hit, but wing them to free a carrier pigeon, shoot the pigeons to complete the tune, which is just a repeat of what was on the back cover. So I would say this game is influenced to some extent by the game Phoenix, in the way these planes fly down at you, and the fact that you can only destroy them by shooting them dead center. That's like one of the levels in Phoenix. So the idea of the game as it's been described on the packaging and so forth, you've got to shoot these planes, but really what you've got to do is shoot them on the wings. That then releases a little carrier pigeon that flies across the screen. When you shoot that pigeon, it puts a note on the musical stave at the top of the screen, and when you've completed the tune at the top of the screen, then you complete the level and you get a bonus. You can also shoot the planes dead center and that destroys them. So there's sort of 2 ways to play this. One is just wipe out the planes, but really the way you get the big bonuses is to shoot these pigeons and get the notes. Graphically, it's pretty nice, fairly simplistic single screen gallery shooter, but the animation of the pigeons is quite nice. And there's a nice little touch when you do shoot an enemy plane. A little cross appears in the graveyard next to the church on the right hand side, so that's quite a nice touch, I thought. Otherwise, the graphics are fairly basic. Sounds are also pretty simplistic in terms of just your normal sort of shooting sounds. But I would say that the music when you complete a stage is quite nice. The BBC Micro, not amazing for music, but it's a pretty nice tune, as was the tune on the title screen. So I think this is quite a decent game actually. It's quite original. I don't think I've seen a game like this where it's got 2 possible ways of completing a level, one of which awards you a lot more points. In terms of the movement of the player, it's a bit simple. It's just left, right and shoot. The way the planes come down to you, they can just crash into you, especially if you stick yourself to the edges of the screen, so that's a little bit annoying. But overall it's pretty playable, quite addictive, reasonable sort of high score challenge, pretty unique idea, and I would have been more than happy to have seen this in the Silver Range lineup for the Commodore 64. Up next we have The Hacker, nothing to do with the Activision game of almost the same name. This one was released in 1984 originally and then re-released in the Silver Range packaging in 1986. And the packaging is pretty ropey generally. I like the background here of the circuit board, that's quite nicely done, but the guy in the foreground sitting on the pile of microchips with 2 telephones in his hands with the cables all wrapped around his neck, that's pretty badly drawn. And the logo is just a generic sort of digital clock type font, so yeah, not very impressed with that. On the back it says, the Hacker is the ultimate technological voyager capable of travelling from terminal to mainframe via the telephone network. There are 12 treacherous stages to overcome before the Hacker reaches the access code at the heart of the system. Grit your teeth and hold on to your floppies. The game starts with quite a nice title screen, as you can see here, with a big Firebird logo on, and you can see that the game was created by Timothy J. Wilkinson and John R. Day. The music in the background, not great in my opinion. So when you get into the game itself, it's a pretty typical 8-bit platform game inspired by the likes of Manic Miner. You have to navigate the platforms and avoid the enemies and collect some floppy disks, I assume that's what they're supposed to be, the white things, and make your way to the exit. So it's exactly the same principle as Manic Miner. It's just left, right and jump in terms of controls. So like Manic Miner, you've got this long arcing jump that's particularly annoying, and you'll end up jumping into places that you can't avoid and end up getting killed. This game is very infuriating from my experience. I'm not a fan. The graphics are really poor. They look like the kind of graphics you'd see on a type-in game from the Micro user or Acorn user back in the day. Not much animation on them, pretty simplistic for the most part. On this first level, the conveyor belts are those purple things and they just don't move at all until you jump on them and end up sliding along. So you don't know which way they're going, which is particularly annoying. Also, there's places where you'll jump off something hoping to reach a platform on the other side and just drop straight down and die. When you die, you'll get sent back to the beginning of the level, or you don't have to recollect all the items, so that is something. One thing that I do quite like though on the very first level is that you actually jump up the side of the screen where it says hacker. It took me a few goes to work out how to get any further than that second level up, and you do it by jumping into the writing on the right hand side, as you'll have already seen as you've been watching this. The big problem is it's really hard. The first level, I'm sure there's no way to get off it without losing at least one life, because the disc right at the top right hand corner, you don't seem to be able to get to it without killing yourself. So that's particularly annoying. So I've only ever got to the second stage on this, and overall not impressed. The sound's also terrible. The noise of him walking along is infuriating, and the jumping sound's not very good either. And apart from that, there's not much else to speak of. So not impressed with this one at all. It's a very run-of-the-mill 8-bit platformer. There's loads of better ones, and even for $1.99 asking price. There was a game that I covered in my video recently called Hunky Dory that was a bug bite release, which would have probably cost $1.99 or $2.99. That's a far superior game than this on the BBC Micro, albeit with exactly the same premise. So yeah, interesting idea perhaps with having all the microchips and things like that, but it's really a poor game, and I'm glad it didn't make it to the Commodore 64. Let's move on then, and the third and final game to be released in the Silver Range packaging, or re-released I should say, was Star Drifter. Now this was actually released in 1986 in the Super Silver packaging by Firebird, which was a $3.99 game, and then re-released the same year in the Silver Range packaging. So taking a look at the packaging, it's pretty nice, this one. Typical sort of space scene on the front there with a spaceship that vaguely resembles something from Star Trek or Star Wars. Another spaceship in the foreground as well. Some asteroids and a nice logo with a nice border around it, sort of reminiscent of something like Tron perhaps. Now from the front cover you'd probably expect this to be some kind of space shoot 'em up, but it's actually an adventure game. As you can see from the two screenshots on the back, it's a maze based arcade adventure, and it says, one of the Class 7 B ships of the ill-fated galactic colonization program has mysteriously re-entered Earth's space, totally silent. Non-humanoid life forms have been detected on board. Enter the ship and take part in this extraordinary graphic adventure through 120 rooms to solve the enigma of the Star Drifter. Now the presentation on this one isn't great. There's no title screen or anything like that other than this thing here with the high scores on. What you will notice though is that it's got the same two authors as the Hacker, but this is a vastly superior game, so they obviously honed their development skills over the 2 years between that game and this one. It's a flick screen arcade adventure, maze based, and on first glance you might think it looks a little bit like Cybertron Mission, which was another BBC Micro game. But I'd say it actually more resembles a game like Saber Wolf, the ultimate game, because it's got that roaming around the maze, randomly spawning enemies, a few things to pick up and places to go. But there's a particular point that you'll see at some point during this video where when you hit a door that you can't get through, you get flung back across multiple screens, which was something that was prominent in Saber Wolf. So yeah, the idea of the game, I'm not entirely sure because I haven't read the full instructions, but I think you've basically got to go around picking up certain objects, taking them to certain places and solve this mystery and escape from this spaceship probably. There are various objects to pick up. The first one you'll find is a gun, which you need to shoot all the bad guys, and you get that within the first couple of screens. So there's a variety of doors to get through. Some can be shot through, some can be walked through, but they're like a force field, so if you walk through when the force field's on, you get zapped. There's also a number of keys to be collected, and you use those to open the doors, but each door needs 2 different keys. So for example, you might need key number 1 and 2 to get through a particular door, otherwise you can't get through it. So that's quite an interesting touch, not something I can think of from any other games, quite original. There's lots of just random things to pick up for points and lots of enemies to shoot. I've got nowhere near to completing this, but I do think it's quite a decent game. Typical sort of flick screen arcade adventure that you got on the 8-bit machines. Nothing outstanding about it, but the graphics are quite colourful, different enemies to shoot and objects to pick up. Your main character is fairly crudely drawn, but moves around at a nice pace, although strangely he moves up and down a lot slower than he does left or right, and there's also quite a bit of slowdown when there's a lot of enemies on screen. You've got 3 lives and also an oxygen gauge. You can pick up oxygen as you wander around, and that's also like a health bar effectively. So yeah, it's got a high score challenge to it, but it is more of an exploration adventure game. Sounds are pretty limited on it, it's just the noise of picking things up and shooting pretty much, so nothing too great there. But overall I think it's one of those games that if you invested a bit of time into it, you make a bit of progress each time, and it's not too difficult. There's a lot of enemies around, but they're usually quite easy to shoot, so not too difficult. What makes it a little bit more tricky though is the fact that you've only got a 3 item inventory, and you nearly always want to be carrying the gun, so that means you have to keep swapping out items as you need them, particularly those keys. And that would no doubt lead to quite a bit of backtracking, moving backwards and forwards through the ship as you try to progress through the game. I think this would have made a pretty decent game on the Commodore 64, certainly better than something like the Willow pattern, for example, which is another game of a similar style where you move around the maze collecting objects and getting through doors and things like that. So yeah, not a bad game, and I think that would have been perfectly acceptable Commodore 64 game if it had been ported over. Finally then, let's move on to the one and only Silverbird packaging game that was ever released for the BBC Micro and Acorn Electron. Video Classics. This is a game that I've already reviewed for the Commodore 64, and you can see that the packaging is almost identical. It's just got the BBC Electron flash on the corner and the spine. The screenshots are all from the Commodore 64 version, and all the information on the back is the same. So let's move on to the game itself. Firstly, you can see that just like on the Commodore 64 version, in game it's called Blip. It's got exactly the same title screen, and you've got the same 6 options for the different game modes, but that's where the similarities end really, because the quality of these games is vastly inferior to the Commodore 64 version. We'll look at a few of them here. This is the basic Pong mode, and it looks okay, it's not too bad, but the bats move really slowly. It's really hard to return most shots, but actually what you can do is work out when you're playing against the computer exactly where to position the bat, because it always hits the shots back in exactly the same way. So it soon becomes a bit tedious because you can just return every shot and win a point. Much like the Commodore 64 version, it's got this really long time limit, and then you score 10 points per shot not returned, if you want to call it that. So graphically that doesn't look too bad. But then we move on to the soccer version, and this is a real assault on the senses with this bright green and yellow background. You can barely see the ball moving around on it. Again, the bats move really slowly. You can move your striker bat, if you like, the furthest form forward, backwards and forwards a little bit. Doesn't really seem to make much difference. I actually played this game for about 2 minutes and not a single goal was scored because it just kept bouncing around in the corners. As you can see here, sort of backwards and forwards in the corners. No one's getting anywhere close to scoring a goal. That was on a previous playthrough. Obviously you can see that the computer scored a couple on this one, but actually I never scored a single goal on this because they always managed to return it. The goal mouth is really small, so it's really hard to get a shot in. It's just really boring. The 2 more interesting game modes on this were of course the 4-bat Blip, which is what's on the screen now, but this is again really tedious on this particular version of the game because you can return every shot just by moving slightly up and to the left with your 2 respective bats on 2 consecutive shots, and it always goes back to the opposite corner when you're playing against the computer. I imagine this might be a little bit more fun against another human player, but not much to be honest. And finally, the most interesting mode from the Commodore 64 version was the Aster Blipperoids, which in this one is pretty bland with the colours, and again it's really hard. The bat just moves too slowly in all these game modes, although it looks quite nice. It's too hard because the bat just moves so slowly that you can't return those shots that hit off the asteroids that are close to you. So yeah, all in all, a pretty dismal offering of Pong games, and while I said that the Commodore 64 version was worth the $1.99, this one definitely wouldn't have been. So there you go, that was the 4 games released in the Silver Range or Silverbird packaging for the BBC Micro and Acorn Electron. Hope you enjoyed watching this video. Let me know in the comments any thoughts you've got about those games. Do you think any of those were worthy of porting to other systems? And for me, it'll be business as usual. In the next video, I'll return to reviewing the Commodore 64 games in the Silver Range and Silverbird range. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.